Welcome, and thank you for tuning in. You're listening to the Beyond 50 radio program. I'm Daniel Davis. Celebrating Father's Day, we're going to be learning about something that all males should be listening to if they get a feeling that there's a particular hole in their soul when it comes to an absentee dad. According to our guest today, disconnected males who don't have a strong sense of inner guidance can become abusive towards women and even destructive towards men. This is what is known as irritable male syndrome, and our guest is a renowned psychotherapist who coined this particular term. We'll be talking about father wound resulting from a father who was usually physically or emotionally absent. You can also discover more at the website menalive.com. I'd like to welcome to the Beyond 50 radio program today our guest, Jed Diamond. Jed, thank you for being on the program today.
Well, it's really good to be with you. Thank you so much for inviting me.
You bet. Now, I know that you've been working with both men and women who love them for more than 40 years. Can you tell us what got you started in this particular field?
Yeah, there are really a couple of things that were at the core of this. The first, which I didn't realize at the time, but yeah, I grew up with a father that was absent. He left home when I was 5 years old, and my mother had to go out to work at that point, and so our lives were really disrupted, but, you know, you grow up with whatever you have, and you get on with your life. And it wasn't until my first son was born that I really realized that I wanted to be a different kind of father than my father was able to be for me. And I made a vow to him when they put him in my arms that I would do everything I could to change the world so that fathers really were engaged and involved with their children, you know, from the beginning of their lives to the end. And that really was the start of this work that I've been doing that kind of comes under the umbrella of Men Alive, helping men and the women who love them.
Now, let's talk a little bit about this irritable male syndrome. Now, I understand that it can be a situation where it seems that women trigger shame in men and how men trigger fear in women. How does this work here? What's going on?
Well, just a little bit of background. Where this started was I wrote a book way back in 1997 about the changes that men go through when they hit somewhere around 50. It could be 45 to 55. And I called it male menopause because I thought initially that there weren't any things that were really similar about the male change of life to the female change of life. But as I did the research, I realized there were a whole lot of similarities in hormonal changes and psychological, emotional changes. So when I wrote that book, it became an international bestseller, translated into 18 foreign languages and read all over the world. And what I realized with the research was that irritability and anger were often one of the chief symptoms, that men didn't understand why they were becoming irritable and angry. Women didn't understand it. And so there were at this core these, midlife and older person changes that started with hormones and then kind of rippled out from there to have psychological and relationship effects. And it tied in very, very much with this kind of core issue where I see that men inadvertently frighten women. We do it through our voices just are louder. My wife would say, I get a certain look in my eye when I'm starting to get irritable and angry that frightens her. And I think women, in a similar reciprocal way, shame men without trying to. They put us down in ways that they're not trying to put us down, but they indicate that there's something the matter with us, or we're not doing it quite right. And many men will tell me, geez, it just feels like I can't ever please her fully. So as this reciprocal back and forth difficulty happens, often relationships get undermined and problems begin to happen, often surfacing at midlife, even in relationships that have been good and productive and positive up until then.
Wow, I didn't realize there was so much to a component such as this.
Yeah, there's a lot to it, and part of why I've been doing this counseling work and writing books for all these years is that, these issues, we think of men as kind of simple creatures, but really men and women are pretty complex and relationships are pretty complex. But at core, we all want a happy, joyful relationship, and that's what I've been doing in my work to help people learn the skills and get the information that they need that can help them along the way.
Now, you talk about, or let's say you outline that there are 4 key causes of depression and aggression. Let's talk a little bit about what that is and how we can come to see it, maybe even manage it.
Yeah, well, one of the key parts is that we generally don't realize, number one, even being irritable. I'll have men say, she accused me of being irritable. I don't know what she's talking about. Or, I'm not irritable. Or it's just become so much a part of our way of being that we're not even aware of it. And when I started doing the research for the book, The Irritable Male Syndrome, I realized that when you really looked at the underlying causes, we found out that there were hormonal changes that were going on. I mentioned that. There were changes in brain chemistry where often as a result of our diet, which I can talk a little more about, there are changes in stress patterns that I think we become more and more stressed as time goes on, and also we live in a very stressed out society. And then the fourth cause is the changing roles that I think men are struggling with, as are women in their own ways, that we really don't understand. And when these things are hidden or buried or misunderstood, what emerges is simply this kind of slow boil irritability all the way to full-blown, hitting your head against the wall, or physical or emotional violence that, can really obviously undermine a man's his self-esteem and undermine a woman's feeling of safety, in a relationship or in any relationships where you have two people. If this irritability and anger is not understood and not well treated, again, it becomes then toxic to the relationship.
I found something that was pretty intriguing, and that is that you talk about how irritation masks depression. Now, How is that possible? But I think a lot of people think, well, aren't those two different things? But it seems that one is kind of overlooking or kind of overlapping the other one, I guess.
Well, exactly. The Irritable Male Syndrome was kind of the popular book where I really help people recognize that the common symptoms that we think about when we think about depression often are symptoms that are more associated with the way women experience depression. That is, they're sad, they cry, in a sense they look inward, they blame themselves. And when we see these other symptoms of irritability, outward aggression, sometimes drinking alcohol, these, I call them acting out kinds of things. But when you really then talk to the men and help engage with them, you find out that the irritability, the anger, the acting out really is covering over some very deep sadness, wounds, feeling of inadequacy, feeling of shame and not being the man that they want to be. And yet when women are depressed and they look sad, they elicit help. People want to be drawn towards them. When men are irritable and angry, rather than getting the help, the support, the nurturing that they need, they tend to push people away, and they get classified then as not depressed and needing help, but they get classified as aggressive and angry and sociopaths or whatever. And I think they get misdiagnosed and mistreated, and that contributes then to the fact that, and this is factual, that the suicide rate for males is 3 to 18 times higher than it is for women of the same age. Wow. And that the suicide rate for males increases dramatically when men hit 50 and above. So we can talk about that, but that's something that I think has been grossly neglected. And so I've written books, and I have a special practice in counseling for both men and women where the irritability and anger really are causing problems, and that we're not treating the underlying causes, which often have to do with, depressed men that just have not been recognized, nor have they been treated or supported.
Now, one thing to bring up here is that unresolved feelings seem to increase as men get older when it comes to having a distant father. Why is it that happens instead of the idea that time heals?
Yeah, exactly. Well, time heals certain things, and time does not heal other things. What time does is it softens the edges of whatever wounds or feelings or hurts that we have. We don't feel it as intensely, but the way I have seen it and why my practice as a therapist and most of my books have focused on men and women in their 40s and older. And what we find is that often the wounds from childhood that we all have, what I found when I wrote the book, My Distant Dad, Healing the Family Father Wound, is that not only myself, and I share my own healing journey, but I found millions of men and women grew up with fathers that were either distant, were absent, were rejecting, or were dysfunctional in some ways. And as I said in kind of the introduction, we tend as people to we grow up, we get past our childhood. If we survive, we kind of push it in the past. The feelings that were painful, we tend to repress or bury. But what happens is in midlife, and this speaks to your question, often these unresolved issues start bubbling to the surface. And there's some reasons why midlife, we're re-looking at our lives. Often it's a big transition. So however that happens, at midlife, in our 50s, these unresolved issues start bubbling to the surface, and we become more irritable, we become more angry, we start feeling more depressed. And again, if we understand these, this can be an opening to not only healing the past, but recapturing, our passion and our power and our purpose in lives. If we don't do that when you hit 50, and I'm sure you see this with many of the people you know and many in your audience, that when we lose that sense of power, passion, and purpose, we start feeling that we don't have much to live for, or our lives become less intense and glorious. And as a result, we start living life in black and white rather than technicolor. And the more we do that, the more hurt, angry, irritable, and disconnected we become. At the extreme, men, I think the fact that we have so many suicides, we know just recently the suicide of Anthony Bourdain, who is, a world-famous cook and TV celebrity, and just recently committed suicide. We see these in the news over and over again. This happens, in the past, will happen again in the future. A lot of it's happening because we're not recognizing these changes, and in midlife they surface, and again, we have a wonderful opportunity to say, all right, it's time to understand these issues, not to run away from them, not to bury them, and not to just act them out through being irritable, angry, and upset with ourselves and the people in our lives.
Now, I find this pretty intriguing as well. I remember going back to a movie. It was called Riding in Cars with Boys. And so this was a movie about a woman who, for the most part, raised her son as a single mother. And there was a point in the movie where the son, of course, is grown now. He's a young man. And he seemed to express something, and when he said this, I thought to myself, wow, because I, never knew my natural biological father, for instance.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Now, in this particular scene, he basically sort of sticks it back at her and says, most of my life you kind of looked at me like, there was a way that you were punishing me for something that I wasn't really responsible for. Now, again,
Mm-hmm.
this isn't verbatim, but this is the idea behind this scene here. And I thought to myself over the years, and maybe it's a deep instinct that we have naturally, especially in a situation where there is a single mom or a single parent, is that I felt that there were times that I was being maybe overly punished or elusively criticized as though my mother was working through me a way to get back at a father that basically left her as a single pregnant mother. If that makes any sense.
Absolutely.
Let's talk about that a little bit.
Well, I think, you describe a situation that's true for really millions of people. We talk about the hole in the soul that occurs when we grow up with an absent father. In my own life, and you touch on this in your experience, is that I knew when my father left when I was 5, my mother, I felt the wounds of not having a father, but my mother lost a husband at that time, and she had a lot of hurt and pain that as I grew up often, got expressed that I didn't understand at the time of issues in our relationship between my mother and I, which really had as much to do with the hurt and pain that she suffered with my father that unknowingly got projected onto me. And I see this quite often of women who have their own wounds. Then, again, they're not trying to do that, but if you don't understand them, they're not understood and treated, you start treating your sons, in this case, in some ways with an overlay or a shadow from the wound that they got from the absent husband in their life. And then many women, and this is true in my case, I found out, I knew my mother's father had died when she was 5 years old, same year that my father left. And I didn't understand because she never talked about the impact of herself growing up with a father wound. So I think these issues are intergenerational when you start looking at them. And often when you start to understand them, you see that the wound I might have, or that feeling of, not feeling complete, or feeling that there's something missing, or being in a relationship with a woman who seems more irritable at us than something we may have done, that we realize there's something from the past, that this shows up in our grandparents' generation or our great-grandparents' generation. But the good news is that when we heal these wounds, not only can we take care of the present and have a better relationship with our present partners, but it puts into place a lot of the misunderstandings about our own lives. And this is what I write about in my new book, My Distant Dad, that I really help people understand how these wounds not only manifest through the generations backwards, and sometimes then, with our own children and future into our grandchildren, but how they can be healed. And so I have this book and a workbook. The new book is coming out on Father's Day, and then the workbook that goes with that helps people work through their own intergenerational healing, maybe just back to their own fathers, or sometimes back to grandparents and grandmothers and grandfathers and back previous generations. But once, in a sense, you get the healing code, then we can heal the past and into the future and be able to have better relationships that we pass on to our children and grandchildren.
Now, I know you've been doing this work for quite a long time. I think it's been for about a half a century now, hasn't it?
Yeah, it's hard to believe that this year
time flies when you have a
celebrates
passion
50
and a
years.
purpose.
Yeah.
You know, so in all this time, and you were actually touching on this a couple of times in some of the answers to what we were talking about here, is that this also can show up in later generations, and I couldn't help but think to myself, for instance, in the Chinese, in their culture, they have a philosophy that the man or the father, if he does not conquer his fear, whatever that particular fear may be, then he passes that on to his son to take care of.
Yeah.
And so when you take a look at this situation and you start really realizing, for instance, well, if your father wasn't around and you had children, you might say, excuse me, that, well, you know, I was there to take them to school and I was there for their plays and their baseball games, but then all of a sudden you find that you're not around so much anymore. And you're wondering, well, why am I doing that? Yeah. You know, you can see how those habits actually come from a particular way. It's something, if you actually, I love watching animal nature documentaries, it's imprinting. It's, you know, the children, you know, watch what their parents do and basically repeat the same behavior because instinctively that's how they're supposed to survive. And I see that we're, as intelligent as humans are supposed to be, we're not too much different.
Yeah, exactly. And not only is the imprinting social, but there's actually some new research that shows that genetically we actually, the wounds from our growing up actually change the way our genes express themselves. And so when we have trauma or loss or an absent father in our growing up, then that gets passed on genetically as well as through, you know, our social learning. So the good news is that, you know, the genetics don't mean that they're cast in stone, because we know through the new research on what's called epigenetics that although the DNA structure doesn't change, that there actually are switches in the DNA way that it's expressed that allows healing to occur throughout our lives, so that we can not only heal, you know, our present situation, but through that we can actually pass on, you know, better understandings and better brain chemistry, better genetic expression to our children and grandchildren, which is what, you know, any of us that have children and grandchildren know, you know, whatever's happened to us in our lives, we want to heal ourselves and be able to pass on something better to the kids.
So, you know, and what we've talked about here today, obviously, as males get older, you're saying that, for instance, hormones may have something to do with it, but they're not entirely the reason. And I would think that it basically comes to a point where, let's say you have that hormonal change in the male, that it amplifies, obviously, something that's been there for a while. Would that be an accurate way to describe that?
Yeah, exactly. You know, there's the way I describe, there's multi-factors, and some are more important to one person than the other. So in my counseling, you know, I look at the genetic factors. What did you grow up with? I look at family history. I look at your psychological makeup. I look at the way things are expressed interpersonally in your relationships with people close to you. I look at, you know, the social issues, spiritual issues, because we're really a whole person. And, you know, we in our kind of fragmented society, we tend to look at one part or this part or that part. But, you know, I think we need to see the whole of who we are, as well as the specific parts that make up the whole.
So now, I know that we've certainly touched on it, but let's talk about, let's say, some of the symptoms that people can recognize, for instance, that they may have what's called this irritable male syndrome.
Right.
And, you know, because as you're talking about epigenetics, we've certainly had our fair share of wonderful doctors, neuroscientists on the program, and one thing that has become clear over the many years we've been doing the program is I agree with you, is that change genetically is not only possible, but it's a very natural expression of the person. You know, when people say, well, no, it's in my genes, for instance, you hear this, well, there was a predisposition for cancer, diabetes, all those really rough things, so it means I'm going to get it. And I'm like, no, that's not true. Did you ever take a look at the behavior factors of the people in your family? What were they doing that maybe encouraged these things to come on? And realize that it isn't really so much genetics. And in this particular case, you're saying in genetics, it shows this is true, that change is not only possible, but in a case like this, it becomes very necessary. Otherwise, those things will find a way, for instance, the illnesses, the diseases, to express themselves because you're not paying attention. But let's go ahead and talk about some of the symptoms here that people may become aware of, so they can say, maybe I might want to take a look at how I can address this because I'm not feeling so happy about it.
Right. Well, let me kind of give you a resource while I'm talking about this and a little bit of the background in gathering data for the book, The Irritable Male Syndrome. I did a survey of 50 different symptoms that I thought might touch on this, and I gave them to 100 men and 100 women and interviewed them and got feedback that I used in the book. But the survey became so popular, I left it up online. And over the years since I did the book, we now have probably 60 to 70,000 people have taken the quiz. And it does a number of things. It helps you know what symptoms may be present in your life. Number two, it helps you understand how serious the symptoms might be in terms of the problems that might come later, hopefully to prevent them. And it also helps you understand that there are actually different subtypes of irritable male syndrome depending on what group of symptoms that you have. And so your listeners can check this out. I've kept it up. I have a website. You mentioned menalive.com that has all my information, but we also have a site for people that just want to take the quiz and get their own results. It's simple. It's called imsquiz.com. IMS standing for Irritable Male Syndrome. So just the letters imsquiz, Quiz.com. You can take the questionnaire yourself, get your own score, but basically the common symptoms, have to do with this obviously sense of irritability and different ways in which it expresses itself. But we also find that symptoms include just feeling more on edge, that things bother us more. That's one thing. We also find that people, feel down and unhappy, more when they're feeling this. We find, number three, that people get more anxious and they're just more worried at times. And we also find that there's this feeling of shame and blame that becomes part of the symptom picture. But people, again, are different. That's why we created the imsquiz.com, so people can find out their own score. If you take the quiz, it's a free scoring that it'll score it for you, and then tell you which subtype you might have. That then helps see whether you tend to be the grouchy type, the type that may be volatile and fiery and just feels like the short fuse, where anything that somebody says feels like it just you react, very reactive. Or there's another type of people that tend to feel low energy, and they're not aggressively angry. They just kind of passive aggressive, and they just don't have a lot of juice in their lives. So all of these things really, just as you point out, help us recognize when something's wrong and then guide us to finding out, in our unique case, what do we need? Do we need to change our exercise pattern? Do we need to change our nutrition? Do we need to change our attitudes and relationships? Do we need to find more purpose in our lives? In the case of men, often as we get older, we lose connections with friends, that they die, move away, and that unlike women, who seem to make friends and keep them longer and make new friends if old friends have left. Men tend to get more isolated and more lonely as they get older, which I think is one of the chief contributions to male irritability, anger, sadness, and obviously in the most extreme cases, male suicides that happen and increase, as I mentioned, in men 50 and older.
And it's amazing to think, too, if you can just become aware that that's there and you realize, well, it's because of this that I don't feel that I'm functioning certainly to the best of my ability when it comes to being happy,
right.
pursuing the things that really fulfill me. But at the same time, I'm hurting people, and I don't mean to, because
right.
there's a point there, where you start questioning, what is wrong with me? Why did I just get triggered and fly off the handle over a simple question? And when you can become aware of that, you realize that you begin to see your own irritability, or perhaps even your own anger begin to stem down, and you're starting to really remove that filter, if you will, that you're experiencing the world in.
Right.
It really starts putting color back into the world, doesn't it?
Yep, totally. And as you point out, often people don't realize, number one, what's causing the irritability and anger. So we blame ourselves, we blame our partner, we blame politics, the world, the stresses, the traffic, all of which, play a part. But ultimately, where, in a sense, the rubber meets the road is in our own internal perceptions and our own world and our own histories. So part of, taking the quiz helps you hone into not only what are the symptoms so that you can identify them better, but also it leads you then to the treatments. That's a lot of what I do at our center at Men Alive is, I counsel people by phone and by Skype and email all over the world, because so many people, this isn't limited to a particular geographic area. It affects men and women. But when you understand what's going on, I've realized that people go, oh, my God, I finally understand now what this is. As you point out, nobody wants to feel miserable, and nobody wants to know that their anger and irritability is hurting their partner, hurting their kids, hurting their work colleagues and friends. And so, the reason I think men don't get help is they don't realize, number one, that this is a problem. And secondly, they don't realize that they can get help. And thirdly, they don't realize that they can get help easily without feeling blamed or shamed or feel like they're bad guys for being angry or irritable or hurtful. They understand, listen, this is, not your fault. You're not to blame. You have a problem that can be treated, and you're responsible for it, and you have to own it. But once you do that, you realize there's a whole host of support that the payoff is healthier life, that you're going to live longer, you're going to enjoy life more, your relationships are going to be better, and what you pass on to your children and grandchildren is going to be a legacy that's much more valuable than any money you might pass on to them. When people get the whole picture, they say, yes, sign me up. I want to get that kind of health and healing for myself and for my family.
This is just such a fascinating subject, and it's interesting how in our pop culture of psychology, the way they approach it versus what you're talking about here, what you talk about seems to be more grounded in reality.
Yeah, well, I've been doing it for 50 years, and it's stood the test of time, and the work has got honed and improved over the years, so that now we've kind of got it down to the things that we know really works.
So stay away from those television shows. Jed, it's been a pleasure to have you here on the program, and your website where people, if they're interested in pursuing this, maybe taking the quiz, finding out, getting more clarity, where would they go to find all that out at?
Well, a couple of things. They can go to menalive.com. If you want to just take the quiz, you can go to imsquiz.com. And for your listeners, I had said I have a gift for anybody that would like it. the new book that I mentioned, My Distant Dad, that looks at my healing journey, will be out on Father's Day. But anytime that anybody would like the free chapter that I offer, you can just email me direct, Jed, J-E-D, @menalive.com, and just put free chapter in the subject line. I'll know it's your listeners, and I'll be glad to send them a free copy and, say thank you and hopefully be in touch with them. And if you have any questions or your listeners have questions, you can ask me direct. I read all my mail and I respond to everybody that writes to me.
Well, very good. Jed, thank you so much for being on the Beyond 50 radio program. This has been very enlightening.
Good. Well, thanks for having me.
You bet. We want to thank you, the listeners out there. Be sure to take the best necessary steps you need to maybe give yourself that special Father's Day gift where you can begin to see more color and vitality in your life. You can also discover more at beyond50radio.com. That is the number 50. We do encourage you to sign up for our weekly e-newsletter to keep up to date with what's going on in the world of Beyond 50, as well as our upcoming shows. I'm Daniel Davis. Thank you for joining us. This is the Beyond 50 radio program. And remember, live your day past halfway.